The views expressed on this podcast are Peter Dekom's opinions based on his legal experience, research, and academic work. The podcast does not offer legal advice. For any legal matters, always consult an independent attorney who can assess your specific situation. And now, on with the show.
Hi, everybody. It's Peter Dekom again. And it's probably sending you into nightmares every night. You recall what I said. So we're basically doing something interesting here. Last time I had a recording session, I did an analysis of, exactly what was going to happen to Warner Brothers Discovery and who the bidders were and what the various strengths were. Well, it seems that the very next day, how fortuitous, there was a little teeny bid made by a company called Netflix. And they just said, we want to buy the whole thing. We are not interested in those secondary channels. And we are going to offer close to $83 billion. And this is from a company that's never spent more than $700 million, which is less than $1 billion, acquiring anything. But the world is changing. And there are a lot of things going on this planet, and it's not exactly coincidental or fortuitous that at the same time as all this mishigas is going on, the United States Supreme Court, they're the guys in the robes, and they're not taking a bath, but they're having us take a bath, basically was considering whether or not to give the executive branch of the United States, a.k.a. the president, basically almost preemptory power over every part of the executive branch, regardless of whether Congress put limitations and checks and balances on it, and basically giving the president the right to fire anyone he would want. Maybe someday she would want. And that is currently, it was argued before the Supreme Court, and I hate to say this, it sure looked like they're going to say yes, with a few strong exceptions like the Federal Reserve, which was purposely designed to balance out any presidential interference. Well, that is actually the core of the story of Netflix and Paramount and what's going on. If you look around you, you'll notice that there are a lot of new conservative people on traditional network positions. They're put on there, whether it's on CNN, which can't work fast enough on any of this stuff to add a conservative voice. MS Now isn't particularly interested in going too far in that direction. And the traditional broadcast networks are all in that leaning into being, quote, more neutral. My take on all of this stuff, and we're going to be exploring a lot of this stuff, is I'm a fact freak. And a lot of times facts aren't the way I want them to be. But I'd rather deal with what is rather than what people want stuff to be. And this battle with Warner Brothers and whoever takes this company is at the core of that reality. So what happens if Netflix, say, succeeds in its almost $83 billion bid to take over? Are you ready for this? It's very specific. It's the studio lot. It's Warner Brothers production in motion pictures and television. It's film and television distribution, but not the channels like, Discovery Channel or CNN or any of the additional channels that are cut out into a separate company. Warner Brothers currently takes about 44% of their programming is licensed from third parties. In other words, they don't create it. They license the product, whether it's sports or old reruns or whatever the hell it is. They license that, and that accounts for 44% of the viewing hours that they are generating as a result of their content. That's an awful lot of their play. And it has allowed them to cut back on where they used to be, which is 50% of original production. And now they're more in the 30% or less production arena. The problem you've got if you're in the motion picture and television industry is there's nothing in it for you. What did I say? Look, a lot of people are trashing, Greg Peters and Ted Sarandos, the two co-CEOs of Netflix. Let me say something about Ted Sarandos. I know him reasonably well. he's not an evil guy. I think one day he woke up and found that he was at the helm of the largest aircraft carrier in the world. And suddenly you have to do things with very large aircraft carriers that you might not do if you're the captain of a destroyer. He started off just caring about content and creating a platform for people to, disseminate their ideas. He was paying for original content that nobody would touch with a 10-foot pole. And slowly but surely, Netflix became the behemoth. It became the main engine of motion picture and television scripted production. Half of all the scripted production that goes on in that television world is Netflix. So if you think that's a lot, you're actually right. If you have that much scripted content, if you have that much unique accents and control, what do you think that does vis-a-vis your ability to raise the price of your subscriptions or offer tiered packages or all the things that go with it? Obviously, if you're a consumer, you know you're going to pay more. No matter how they configure it, no matter what they say, they have to, because there's so much debt being taken on, there's so much risk being taken, someone has to pay for it. And that's going to be you. And if you think you can live with a Disney subscription or maybe a Comcast, description, to something else, maybe Peacock will work for you. Maybe broadcast channels will work for you. But if you want the stuff that's on Netflix, which accounts for literally 50% of scripted programming, you're going to have to pay for it. That may mean that you cut back on some of the other streaming. Oh, that's good. I said that. Freudian slip. Streaming services. And you're going to have to make some decisions. And right now, the way the economy is going, I don't think you're going to want to expand your horizons in that direction. It's also pretty clear that the theatrical motion picture business in theaters, in your local neighborhood theater, if you have a neighborhood still, more importantly, is there's a theater or theaters chain or multiplex that serves that community. When was the last time you went? What did you go see? What would you go to a movie theater to see? And you look at the different kinds of product that go out in the world, you can see where streaming allows niche programming to be much, much, much easier to access different strata of society than having to draw them into a uniform room where everybody sits to do whatever they do, watching the big screen and the chomping on popcorn or whatever. Part of what you have to also take a look at is, why do people go to theaters at all? I mean, it used to be when you're back in the 50s and 60s, you'd take a date and make out in one of the back rows. Well, it's too easy to find places to do that elsewhere. And ultimately, the people don't go to the same kind of movies. If you're basically 55 years old and you have a 17-year-old son or daughter, unlikely that you're going to be going to the same place. There are things where that's not true. The rise of family entertainment is a very, very interesting creative mix. And Disney has probably done better than anybody, although they still have trouble accessing young males to go to traditional Disney films. But the whole family can go to a Disney family film. And there are usually several layers of storytelling, one that reaches the adults and one that is very attractive to younger kids. And they can both go to the same event and come away with two wonderful experiences. I love that. Very complicated writing, but it works. When we're beginning to see things like Zootopia just opened, and it broke records. It's Zootopia 2. It's obviously a sequel. But it cleaned up. And if you look at the dialogue and you look at the animals and critters involved, and by the way, animals tend to be more neutral. The minute you put a male or a female character, particularly a male hero, you're cutting the audience back. I've discovered many years ago that the determinants of which kinds of movies children go to see primarily determined by the mothers of daughters. And it's not something that moms really are into ultraviolence. They're really into sweetness and raising their kids in a particular way. And although women are becoming more important in the elevated world of educated people and also people taking over new and interesting jobs, it's still the same basic approach in the business. So now here's Netflix. It's a giant company. I mean, it's If you can write a check to buy something for $83 billion, you're rich. But at some point, you have to create a rate of return to the investment community, your shareholders, so that basically you can say, okay, I spent this amount of money, but I'm making a return on that investment. And generally speaking, whatever money you invest, depending on the nature of what's competitive at the time you make the investment, you have to generate a rate of return on that investment of somewhere on the low side, if you get away with it, of 5 to 10%. Good luck with that. But on average, Wall Street expects a 20% return on capital investment. And that's year to year. So that means it's not 20% once, it's 20% compounded. And that's the way it works. People find that the growth companies hit strides of somewhere in the 30% area. I think those times are gone. But it's also interesting to see where that money comes from. Neither the Ellisons, representing Paramount and trying to, which came back right after Netflix did its thing, said, no. We don't want just HBO Max, and the studio and the theater. We want everything. So all of a sudden, someone's selling everything. Ellison said, don't count us out, made a hostile takeover. That means one not invited by the management, not negotiated by management, but is being presented to the shareholders as part of a formal process where publicly traded companies have to entertain offers that are made in good faith, that are substantial. And in this case, arguments are going back and forth. Wait a minute. If you look at what we offered shareholders, we're buying the company that Netflix doesn't want, so you're going to get that taken care of. And we're also buying the stuff that Netflix does want. We'll keep everything intact. We are Paramount, Ellison's. We are a motion picture company. We do have smaller channels, and we do have a place for the other ones. And there's talk that, because the Supreme Court is leaning toward giving the president increasing power over the regulatory agencies, there's a lot of dialogue taking place, back channeling, where the rumor has it that the Ellisons, David, have promised Donald Trump CNN will be a MAGA mouthpiece. That doesn't make a lot of people happy. And I have to say, if you're looking at people who work in Hollywood, they're miserable. Everybody knows that this merger is going to result in massive additional layoffs. It's not as if Los Angeles is just filled with lots of jobs for people. There are going to be thousands and thousands of people laid off who've been working in the motion picture and television industry for many, many years who have no place to go. So with all this pressure on coming up with the money so it doesn't break the bank, I mean, Ellison there have been people saying, look, Ellison dudes, if you start buying stuff with a lot of equity, your debt, which that equity supports, is going to slowly move toward the junk bond area. Junk bonds are considered high-risk bonds with high interest rates because you have more risk as the perception goes, so you have to pay higher interest. And you don't want, if you're an Oracle person, you are already fighting investment issues with AI that are massive. You're also in that group of people that Donald Trump wants to lay off TikTok on. So there are lots of pressures for you not to spend all your money, or at least cap out what you're going to spend. So as you go after Netflix, which doesn't have a lot of the same problems, you have to understand Netflix can continue to raise the price. But here's the little fly in the ointment that nobody or very few people are looking at. It seems as Hollywood demands more and more capital, and it is a very capital-intensive industry, a lot of people are using some of the capital for luxury flights or their own private jets to Saudi Arabia. How chic that is. So they're going there and saying, we would like you guys, you Saudis, to basically do something really nice for us. Will you help us buy this Warner Brothers Discovery asset or just Warner Brothers asset? And everyone's going there. It's not just that Paramount Ellison's went there. Netflix went there too. Now, this is an interesting reality where you're going to a country with a value system and religious basis that is fundamentally different from our own. You have a little MBR little incident with a dismembered member of the press in Turkey a few years ago. You're looking at people saying, hey, Saudis, you're greenwashing everything by creating all these sporting events and supporting it, but you're covering up a murder. And the Saudis said, we have nothing to do with it. And Donald Trump on, television, whatever format it was on, said, yeah, I believe him. He had nothing to do with it. But everybody seems to want to take a bite of Saudi money in order to reduce the equity risk that they're bearing. And the Saudis seem, hey, that's cool. Let's go do that. So let's look at the money that goes into this situation. It's not just going to be a check. A lot of this stuff comes from a corporation saying, okay, we'll write a check, but we need to borrow the capital in significant part that we're going to use to write that check. Maybe we'll pay for it by giving them some of our stock. Maybe we'll do a combination of that cash and stock. And so that's where it sits right now. And the question is, you have two different distinct buying patterns. On the one hand, Paramount wants to buy everything. They want to buy the little channels, the CNNs, the Discoveries, HBO Max, Warner Brothers Productions, and the studio. It would be an upgrade of the office towers that Netflix occupies now here in Los Angeles. They would have one of the most wonderful lots in Los Angeles, in Burbank. Been to it many, many, many times. It's kind of magical walking around that lot, and there's so much history there. But what's really going on in the backstory here, and it's a big backstory, we are dealing with a highly politicized game. And the president of the United States occasionally will get involved and say, we have national security things. We don't want this to be sold or that. But Donald Trump's been friend with the Ellisons for a long time. There was always a wink, wink. Don't worry, David and Larry. Donnie is here for you. We'll figure out what to do. And as the Supreme Court seems to suggest, you have complete power, Mr. President, or this is what we expect him to rule in June. You have the complete power to fire almost anybody in one of these administrative regulatory commissions, like SEC, FTC, which was the case at Barr, maybe even, I don't know, all these things. And so you're basically saying, wait a minute, Donald Trump controls directly the administrative approvals and the personnel who make those decisions. And he's basically saying, don't worry about it. And someone asked him, who you favor? And of course, Donald, telling the truth as he always does, says, I don't have any favorites, but if it gets complicated, I will get involved. Well, clearly he has. I hate to say this, but I don't actually hate to say this, but Ted Sarandos isn't exactly bosom pals with Donald Trump, whereas Larry Ellison and David Ellison have gone out of their way to extend a hand there. And if they are indeed saying to Donald Trump, we don't know this for a fact, we're not in the room, the rumors are abounding, that there is an absolute deal that if this is consummated in favor of Paramount, Donald Trump will have an entire cable television network over and above Fox, which is mostly his, but you still have Rupert Murdoch, who has occasionally something to say about things, although he's getting long in the tooth. But it appears that CBS, which is also owned by Paramount, and CNN will slowly drift to the right. And right now, CBS is drifting to the right. I didn't say slowly. It is. People are leaving CBS. Anchors who've been there for years are gone. You're looking at new realities where people are basically bringing in more Republicans, more right-wing Republicans, more MAGA players into the various panel discussions that you see on CBS. And, NBC, what are you doing, NBC? Well, we are part of the Comcast group. We're not bidding on everything, but we understand this regulatory world. And what has happened in the United States, when you decide you're going to buy a company or do whatever you're going to do, you used to have to worry about something called antitrust. And it should mean I don't trust you, but it has a different meaning. But I'll talk about antitrust laws in a moment because they're really important, and we haven't been using them at all or much very well. But everything goes through every merger, every whatever gets through an antitrust Hart-Scott-Rodino review to see how it impacts the commercial reality of the world. And with these mega corporations, when they do mergers and acquisitions, they're not just subject to U.S. approvals. If they do enough business overseas, read European Union, UK, they are now also subject to being approved. These mergers and acquisitions have to be approved by the regulatory bodies there. So you're watching a lot of push-pull. So let's talk a little bit about what antitrust what it means. Back in the 1890s, and I love the dramatizations that have been recreated based upon this. You had Andrew Carnegie, the Vanderbilts, railroads, you had coal, you had steel, you had all kinds of stuff, banking. John Pierpont Morgan controlled the check writing capacity of the United States, might as well have been the Treasury of the United States. But these players basically conspired among themselves who got to buy what, who merged what. And if you happen to be a railroad, you might need to have stuff being transported on that railroad. So there's a lot of stuff going on back and forth. Basically, the losers were consumers. Consumers were basically watching big billionaires conspiring among and between themselves to set prices and exclude anyone who wasn't ready to play ball. And if there were small players out there, they would just get bought out or they'd be bullied into non-existence. Rockefeller was called before the court. All these people were sued on this new set of laws, the Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890. You know, you assholes have just got to stop doing this shit. They didn't exactly frame it that way, but that's pretty much what the prosecutors and everyone else said. And the remedy under the antitrust laws was not, okay, we spank you, bad person, you go. The remedy was to break up the company, tear it apart, and in some cases, there is also potential criminal liability associated with violating the antitrust laws. And so the United States went batshit, breaking up these big companies back in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And it was a very big change. And it was a battle that was fought every day of the year by every big player in the United States. Now, there's a big difference between American antitrust laws and European antitrust laws. Under the U.S. law, being big alone isn't bad enough to get you spanked and broken up. What's bad is when you manipulate the marketplace, where you fix prices, where you push other people out of competitive advantage, and when you merge with companies that makes you grow faster than what you would normally grow in an organic growth process. Europe says if you're big, we don't care how you got there. If you're big, you're a problem for us. So we have to make sure we control what you can do within our territory and how much of the market you can have. So you have situations where a company will pass muster in the United States, and Europe will say, I don't think so. You got all kinds of loosey-goosey stuff in the U.S. We in Europe create our antitrust laws based upon your failures. So we know that what you used to do no longer works or you're not using it. So our antitrust laws will take on bigness by and of itself. It's also some smaller countries have regulatory power, but if you're not as large as the 350 million audience in Europe, you don't really have that kind of power. And China is so restrictive, they control how many breaths you can take a minute. I know that's a little extreme. But ultimately, we don't have that same issue because basically anything disseminates communications within China is strictly regulated by the government. It's a giant, green wall, and you don't get through it unless China says okay. But Europe is a big deal. So you now have European regulators and American regulators, and it almost never is the case where you have two. In fact, I've never seen it, where a company is regulated by Europe and the United States, but they wind up in two different corporate structures that are not implementing the underlying merger that was anticipated. So you're going to see a result, whatever happens. If Paramount is successful in taking over Netflix, which is all over Europe, or if, in fact, Netflix, not taking over Warner Brothers, if Netflix takes over Warner Brothers, you're going to see that too. Nothing is ordained. A lot of people, I want to read a couple of headlines, which I think are pretty interesting. And one of my favorite was, why does everybody hate Netflix? And I can tell you, it's not pretty. I have the paper here, but it's very interesting because nobody seems to like it. I mean, it's convenient if you're a consumer. It's convenient if you're a consumer unless they start jacking up the price to the point where you can't afford it. It's convenient for a place like Netflix if you're hiring actors, directors, producers, and writers, because if you represent half of the scripted television in the country, you pretty much can pay them what you want. And collective bargaining agreements, you have all the leverage in the world. People don't have upside when you make deals at Netflix. You don't get a piece of, oh, that movie made so much money. Look at how much the actor, director, writer, etc., how much they're making in this. There are bonus structures that are built in, but they're not remotely as lucrative as the days when people owned the content directly and placed it into channels of distribution. Prior to 1948, the major studios actually owned the theaters too. And in 1948, there was a consent decree where the theater said, okay, we won't do that anymore. We'll spin off theaters and make arm's length deals with it. That also happened in television. In the 60s and 70s and stuff, the networks were owning everything they produced, and they would dictate the terms. There were literally 3, then ultimately 4 networks. You either took what they gave you or you didn't get your product on the air. And then the Federal Communications Commission, one of these great administrative agencies, implemented a rule where creative content providers had to own the underlying rights, and they were only licensing X number of runs to networks, generally 3 runs. And then after those 3 runs, the people who were the content suppliers owned the content, and the rerun marketplace exploded, and people made hundreds of millions of dollars in that world. You remember The Cosby Show? It probably, aside from spinning off someone who spent a lot of time in courtrooms, it also spun off an awful lot of cash flow, making the owners of that little franchise hundreds of millions of dollars of profits. And so the television world was great until early 1990s, 1991. The FCC said, there's so many channels of distribution, we're going to eliminate those rules. If networks want to own the content, we'll let them have a piece of the content. So the world changed, and the amount of money you could make in television dropped like a stone, unless you're an overpaid actor or made an amazing output deal because you're an amazing creative producer and you're able to do all kinds of wonderful things, and fortunes were made. But after 1991, the prices started to come down. Now, I'm trying to figure out who benefits at all from an acquisition of Warner Brothers by anybody. Well, number one, if you're selling content, if you have 7 major buyers, and then one of them gets absorbed, like, for example, let's say Disney bought Fox. Oh, it did. Spent over $70 billion doing that. So now one of the buyers is gone. So let's just say you're looking at Paramount, it just got bought. The Ellisons bought it. It's called Paramount Skydance. Oh, okay. But they're still around, right? Yeah, but they're trying to buy another major studio. So now if you take them, you're going to have 2 major studios, 1 less buyer, gone. And you're looking at places like, Lionsgate and Sony that don't own big streaming networks. They just don't. And they're never going to, because the market's already saturated. Are they orphans? Do they have a future? I think Lionsgate waited a little too long to get absorbed, and Sony is just a different kind of company. It's owned by an electronics games company in Tokyo. And they're all struggling with, how do we exist? And what happens if Netflix gets enough content by buying Warner Brothers that they won't even call us about picking up our content? We're going to be orphans. There'll be nobody there to buy our stuff. What is going to happen to us? Well, they have reason to be worried because basically Netflix is looking to get a little insurance that they have enough content and they don't need to rely on buying content from anybody else. I mean, I would have to think that if I am Netflix and I buy Warner Brothers, I'm probably not going to be particularly positively inclined to buy a former competitor trying to buy the same asset, Paramount's product. So absolutely the price will go down. And here's the problem with all that. If you have one major player in the motion picture and television marketplace paying less for writers, paying less for actors, paying less for directors, everybody pays less. It's such a huge player in the marketplace that it tends to set the pricing standards, even if they're not fixing those standards. And there are other things that we have to be aware of. In the whole world of broadcast television, if you ordered a season of, say, half-hour shows, you would probably get somewhere between 22 and not so much anymore, 26 episodes a year. Okay, that's great. How many episodes is the traditional order pattern for a season at a streamer? Like Apple or whatever. How much would you get there? Answer, we do 8 to 13, and generally averaging 10 is not an unfair number to put there. So I go to half the number of episodes ordered, and that means I have half the number of people writing scripts, half the number of acting days, half the number of directing days. So this seriously impacts people who work for a living in the motion picture and television industry. We all have this notion. Everybody in the movie business, television business, just overpaid. They drive them their Ferraris, Aston Martins, Porsches, whatever. They do that. And I don't have any sympathy for them. I'm telling you, men and women in tool belts are not making a fortune. They make an hourly wage just like any other hourly worker, and they work hideous hours. And here's the difference. Unlike a building, which goes up and it takes a year or 2 or 3 to build, a movie is generally shot in a few months. So what happens is when the movie is shooting, the crews or production crews are making money and they're working. But the day the production stops, oops, they're not paid anymore. That's a very difficult world to live in. And to make matters even more difficult, a lot of the productions are going overseas where the subsidies and the incentives overseas are more lucrative than those in the United States. So people who used to work on crews in the old world, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, et cetera, used to work on a lot, you'd go in and you'd be assigned to a particular show. I actually worked as an operating engineer for ABC Television a long, long time ago, and I was not hired for a show. I was hired by ABC, which could second me over to the local KABC production unit here in Los Angeles, or to ABC Television. I was a cable puller, a cameraman. I did a lot of cool stuff way before I went to film school or law school, and I learned how it worked. But I wasn't hired on a production by production basis. That's not how the movie business works. Nobody goes to a studio and says, okay, I'm going to work here permanently, and you will pay me for on a yearly basis. We'll have an hourly wage, but I will know that it's there. With the exception of animation, which may take years to do, the reality is live action, whether it's done with a little AI or not, is going to be a short-term contract. Now we get to a couple other harsh realities that are affecting everybody in my industry. And that is, you remember the big strike in 2023? First, we had the pandemic. Everybody had fun with that. We didn't work for a year. Now we had, big strike. Nobody worked again for the 9 months. So we're having a real reset in the motion television production arena. Well, that was ultimately settled. But the big issue that still floats around is artificial intelligence. And I will tell you that the Screen Actors Guild American Federation of, Television and Radio Artists, or SAG-AFTRA, the Writers Guild of America, Directors Guild of America, etc., their great terror in the world, more the writers and the actors and the directors, is that they can be replaced. Now, we have this mythology. There's no computer program, no artificial intelligence program that will ever, ever, ever reproduce the emotional connection that good writers, good actors, etc., can bring. Maybe not now, but you can actually replicate the entire process, acculturation of a human being from 0 all the way up to 50 with a simple thing. You just pump in information of life, and maybe you pick a couple of lives, blend them, and you create a new writer-director, a superstar. Let's replicate Steven Spielberg, but update him. We'll make him a computer program. Well, and I've actually seen, someone sent me this set of vignettes of a dirty old lady, probably in her 60s, smoking, drinking, and having sex with younger men, swearing like a trooper. And I thought it was like a stand-up comedian doing her thing. Turns out it's a 100% fake actor. And now you're looking at the fine print in the collective bargaining agreements and the agenda that are set, because that contract that resulted in a long strike and settled in 2023, these contracts go in 3-year cycles. Usually the Directors Guild starts because they're the most reasonable group. This coming set, 2026, 2023 plus 3 is 2026. That's when the next set of contracts are going to be negotiated. For the first time that I can remember, the Directors Guild is not starting the negotiations. They're waiting to the very end because they got screwed last time, and they really had to say, you know what, studios, you said you couldn't pay anymore, and then you made deals with the actors and the writers, and you paid them all more. We want to go last. So it's going to work like this. The Writers Guild is going to start, then the actors are going to get in, and at the end, the directors are going to step in and get their piece. What are they trying to do? Well, there are a couple of very interesting realities. They're not going to stop AI at all. I mean, they're going to stop it. They can try and drag it down or slow it down. But I remember, and I use this analogy all the time, when the automobile was first introduced into small towns back in the beginning of the 20th century, towns would ban cars from their central business districts because they scared the horses. Now, if you want to go and see some horses in cities, you can go to Central Park, although there's a question there, or to Amish country. So I don't see any way in heaven or hell for this to stop. We're looking at a situation where all the dynamic components of the production of creative scripted television and film are changing all at once. We're looking at the same time with the political dynamic changing so that every major business transaction that's happening is subject to some form of government regulation. We're also taking a look at the fact that there's no major player. I mean, if you look at Warner Brothers and Netflix, if they were to combine, together they don't account for more than 10% of the viewing hours of the general public. I mean, obviously YouTube is much higher than that, but their economic structure doesn't pay a lot of money for production. It allows people to create channels and to create licensing schema with ad revenue sharing in a way that works for everybody, except it doesn't cover really, really expensive productions. YouTube is not a funding organization. That comes out to something else. So now we get right back to where we were. We have two major bidders, one hostile, Paramount, Ellison, and one a consenting bidder, and that consenting bidder is buying only, I repeat, the studio, HBO Max, and the theatrical distribution and production wing. The rest of the small channels and cable and all that other stuff are carved out and will go into a separate company. The Ellison offer wants to buy everything. The target, everyone laughed when David Zaslav, who's Warner's CEO, asked for $30 a share. There's not a question in my mind that the ultimate purchase price will be at least $30 a share, if not more. Now, all this means is the more it costs for someone to buy this company, the more they have to find ways to generate revenues to pay for it. Remember, every dollar you spend, if you are using that, you've got to pay off any interest that goes with it. And if it's equity, you've got to give equity somewhere between maybe 15 and 20% return on that equity. So that has to come from somewhere. So if you have to make more money because you're paying more to buy the asset, That means you have to cut costs, so thousands get laid off. The money that you're willing to pay premium actors, directors, writers, etc., has to be less. It can't continue the way it goes. And you have to jack up the price to consumers. There are no winners in this, except that those who dominate the marketplace pretty much call the shots. And they're not worried, oh, you poor little actor, you can't get rich on the movie. You don't make $1 gross deals, or if you do, they're only on the theatrical side. They have nothing to do with the big, beautiful, fantastic business of everything. So, we don't feel badly for you because we have to pay more to our investors, shareholders, banks, lenders, investment banks. We have to do all kinds of stuff. We have to go through a regulatory racehorse in Europe. We got to do it again in the United States, and we may have to do it in a bunch of territories. Really expensive for us to do this. So you ask yourself, why does everybody hate Netflix? I think ultimately the realities that force Netflix to pay less and charge more are not making people in the world happy. I think that this happens at a time when the regulatory scheme of the United States looks like it's going to be shoved entirely into the executive branch of government, which gives Donald Trump more power than any president has ever had in the history of the United States. Not only does he control all the things that he used to control directly, but the Supreme Court appears to be giving him administrative control of every single federal agency with very few exceptions. EPA is his, the consumer thing is his, SEC is his. All these things are now direct appointments where he can fire. And I guess it's appropriate for a guy who worked in Shark Tank is used to saying, "You're fired." He's firing a lot of people, but he's also telling all the people with all the money, the plutocracy, oligarchies structure that he has basically created, okay, I will favor you guys, but you got to give me stuff I want. And one of the things I want to do is I want to kill CNN. I would love to kill MS Now too, but I want to kill CNN. I want to turn it into my mouthpiece. I want my reporters making the stories. And you're watching, if you may have noticed, for example, CBS, you just had the two lead anchors in their nightly news gone. They quit. And you're looking at similar things happening at other networks. It's not a coincidence. This is all profoundly related. I mean, who is going to be the power player? What's going to happen to the most successful theatrical arm of any studio today is Warner Brothers. What happens to that management group? Netflix has its own content guru, Ella Baharia, and does she take over that role, or do they report to her? We don't know what the world is going to look like. I can only tell you it's going to cost consumers more. It's going to pay people working in the industry less, and it's going to basically limit the kinds of choices being made with fewer people's sensibilities being taken into consideration when projects are green-lighted or picked up. If you have fewer studios buying, you not only lose the competition of multiple players bidding on the assets, you also have those people who are the creative deciders within the companies, the green-lighters, the development people, imposing their take on the world on everything. So the homogenizing process on creativity, I have to say, is just not something you want to take lightly. It is a very, very difficult thing. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, well, there's one benefit for being old. I'll be out of here long before this completely collapses. But entertainment is something everybody has done from the time people gathered around a fire and were roasting whatever they caught that day with a spear and telling stories, or the cave paintings that started. Entertainment has been an integral part of our society and our culture. But if you ask yourself, what is the big war that's going on with the United States? Is it immigration? What is it? It comes down to two words, culture wars. And the culture war very much embraces what you see on television, what you see when you go to the movies. And there's a whole bevy of creators who are doing short form content, putting it on YouTube, making limited theatrical releases where they take a theater or two. The world is changing. What will it look like? I don't know. But if you have fewer buyers, doesn't matter where it looks like, this industry is going to be less competitive, more expensive to access the content, and pay less to the people who make and produce the content. And that includes the men and women in tool belts who are anything but rich. I thank you for this. I'm not going to go to the bathroom and throw up. Just call me Chuck. But we'll see what happens, and we'll touch base every now and again. But I have to tell you, I'm not a happy camper. Even though I like a lot of the people who are involved, I don't like the ultimate result of consolidation of power. And neither should you. Until next time, I'm Peter Dekom.
If you would like to give feedback, suggestions for new topics, or have a question that might be selected for a future podcast, please email us at dekompodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. Until next time.